you're doing well today. This is a recording that, who knows, we may make available to a wider public eventually if Tom approves of it. We're speaking today with the author of our book there, which I've learned I can't speak while the book is blocking my face, but the Financial Crisis and Federal Reserve Policy, which we've been covering for a senior seminar a bit. Dr. Lloyd Thomas is the former department head here at Kansas State. You can see he's got his K-State gear on today. And someone I wanted to speak with to get some perspective on a little bit on the current crisis, but mostly on the Great Recession and how we dealt with that and how we've recovered from it, as you've read about in the book. We'll go from there. Tom was at K-State for how many years, Tom? Nearly 40, I think. 35,
47.
47 years. Oh my gosh, I was off by a decade. Yeah, so started in 68, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, so Tom's seen a lot of changes in Manhattan. He and I are both alumni of the University of Missouri, and Tom now on emeritus status here at K-State is teaching a money and banking course at Mizzou, kind of to keep contributing education of a lot of great folks. He gets an honors course there, right? So, Tom today.
Okay. You asked me for Tom? Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess we'll get straight to it then.
Well, let me just say, I feel this tremendous loyalty to K-State. I was there for 47 years. Whenever they play Mizzou, I got to tell you, I'm pulling strongly for K-State. I have a strong love for that university. And so it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, great to be here. And I think you bring that up, maybe embarrass me a little bit, although K-State and Missouri don't play too much anymore. We've got a football game coming up here in a couple of years. And I've had longer term than even I had K-State in terms of athletics, certainly not on the academic side of things. I had a couple of tennis players that I thought very highly of. Every time I would go watch K-State and Mizzou play tennis, I would strongly root for K-State, but I haven't quite gotten there in football yet. Let me share the screen. As we know, we asked for students to ask some questions here, and we got a couple great ones from our students, and we'll start out with that. We'll go with Faith's first. We'll go in reverse order and then get to Cameron's question. But Faith wanted to know, would Dr. Thomas consider Hayek's view that we should have done nothing during the Great Depression better or worse than the Fed's actual actions during that period, which we know were not optimal? Tom, what do you have to say to that?
Well, that's a great question, and that would be a good PhD dissertation to try to sort that out and see, if on balance, the Fed actually damaged things in the Great Depression. And I'm going to point out here, they certainly made some gross errors that they would not make today. In fact, it's clear to me, having studied the role of the Fed in the Great Depression, that they were clearly incompetent. And it's just amazing to see how much better the Fed has been in recent years than they were back there in the 1930s. The Fed really forgot why they were created. In the 1930s, the Fed was created not to do what we regard them as doing today, which is to try to even out the business cycle, to lower interest rates when you're in a recession, trying to stimulate spending, raise interest rates when the economy is overheated, try to stabilize aggregate output. That's what we view the Fed as doing today. But the Fed was not created for that purpose at all. They were created to be a lender of last resort to the banking system. We have this fractional reserve banking system where banks only have a fairly small percent of your deposits, and collectively everybody's deposits on hand in the bank. And if a significant number of fairly large number of customers try to get their money out, the whole system is going to collapse. It's called a fractional reserve system. For example, banks only have reserves equal to probably 2% of the total deposits, including savings deposits and checking deposits. So if more than 2% of those depositors try to withdraw their money, the whole deck of cards is going to collapse. The whole system is going to collapse. banks don't have, they have just a small amount of reserves defined as cash, and now defined as cash plus deposits at the Federal Reserve. But prior to the Federal Reserve, about every 15 years, there would be these banking panics, and this would cause a collapse of the banking system. There'd be a major depression, not just a recession, but a major depression. And the Fed was finally established in 1913 to be a lender of last resort, so they could supply funds to the banking system in the event of a panic. Well, in the 1930s, the Fed forgot why it was created in the first place. They forgot to be a lender of last resort to the banking system. And I just want to point out several gross mistakes the Fed made in response to this excellent question by Faith. For one thing, they permitted bank reserves, which would be cash plus deposit at the Federal Reserve, to drop by 15% in 1931. I think most of you have taken money in banking, and you recognize that the Fed is capable of accurately controlling aggregate bank reserves in the banking system. If the Fed wants to put more reserves into the system, they buy securities in the open market, and that creates reserve accounts for the bank of the seller of those securities, usually a dealer's bank. And so for each $1 the Fed buys of securities, they can put $1 of reserves into the banks. And they certainly knew that by the Great Depression. But in 1931, they sat back while bank reserves fell 15%. Well, since each $1 of reserves can support perhaps $10 of deposits, if you have a 10% reserve requirement, if reserves go down $1, deposits are going to have to go down $10 if you have a 10% reserve requirement. Well, the Fed just sat back during these panics that we had. There was a series of runs on the banks, mostly in 1930 and 31, where the public would panic. There was no deposit insurance. That would pull reserves out of the banks as the public wants their cash out, fearing their bank would fail. 9,700 banks failed in the Great Depression, and about 500 in this recent financial crisis. But the Fed just sat back as reserves fell 15% in 1931 due to these panics, and the Fed just being passive about it. They were passive. The Fed mistakes, some of them were sins of omission rather than sins of commission. Although, as we'll mention here, there were also some sins of commission where they actively did things to make things worse, as opposed to just sitting back and letting things deteriorate, like when the public tries to get their money out. Secondly, the Fed failed to implement open market operations. They should have been buying securities, pumping reserves into the banks. They started to do that briefly in 1932, and started at the result of pressure from Congress, they started buying some securities for a few weeks. But then when they noticed the T-bill rate was approaching zero, which they felt would hurt bank profits, they backed off and just withdrew from pumping reserves into the banks. That was the second mistake, just being passive and not actively using open market operations. The third mistake was when England went off the gold standard in 1931, the Fed jacked up the discount rate. That's the rate the banks would pay the Fed if they borrow reserves from the Fed. They jumped that up from 1.5% to 3.5%. That was a classic response of a central bank to signal to the public, hey, we're going to stay on the gold standard. England just went off, but we're not going to do that. So they jacked up the interest rate while the unemployment rate was 18%. So, that doesn't, that's part of the gold standard, but that's not conducive to getting out of a depression. Number four, they wrote letters to the banks saying, we noticed that some of you are coming in here to borrow from the Federal Reserve. What's going on here? Get your act in order. Don't borrow from the Federal Reserve. Well, the Fed was created so banks could borrow from the Fed, borrow reserves in time of a panic. So it's becoming clear that the Fed was grossly incompetent in the 1930s. And then finally, their discount window policy was very tight. Keynes argued, hey, monetary policy was stimulative because the Fed cut their discount rate 8 times. But even after they kept cutting the discount rate, it was way above the T-bill rate. They should have put the discount rate at 0 and said, okay, banks come in here and borrow reserves. so that the panic doesn't cause this multiple contraction of deposits and a depression. They should have put the discount rate at 0. The discount rate was lowered to a maximum level, lowest level at about 1.5%. But if you're a banker and you're short on reserves, you have a choice. You could sell off your T-bills, which were yielding 1/4 of 1% or 1/2 of 1%, or you could borrow at the Fed at 1.5% at the discount window. Well, hell, you're not going to borrow from the Fed at 1.5%. That's a tight policy. They should have put that discount rate at 0 and said, we're a lender of last resort, come in here and borrow. And once the public is convinced you've got plenty of cash, the public will redeposit their cash back in. Then you can pay off the discount window. The Fed simply didn't do that. They ran a tight discount window policy and even admonished the banks from borrowing at the Fed. Finally, in 1936 and 37, we had, after the major depression from 1929 to 33, we then had 3 years of robust output growth, almost 10% a year, 1934, 35, 36. The Fed noticed banks were holding lots of excess reserves. Now the question is, why were they doing that? Well, probably why they were doing that was that they felt they needed a shield in case there was an additional panic. They needed extra reserves on hand to accommodate a panic. You could get another panic. So they were holding excess reserves. The Fed got nervous. Look at all those excess reserves banks are holding. What if they start lending those out? We're going to have inflation. In other words, they're worried about inflation when the unemployment rate is 18% and the actual rate of inflation is -8% a year. We were having deflation. Why the hell were they worried about inflation under those circumstances? So they saw those excess reserves in the banks and doubled the percentage reserve requirement in 2 steps, 1936, 37. They doubled the percentage reserve requirement, sucking those excess reserves out of the banks. Well, how did banks respond? They respond by tightening their lending policies, deliberately building back up their excess reserves to protect themselves against a possible additional run. So the Fed misinterpreted, thinking, hey, we're going to cause inflation, letting all those reserves be in there. Meanwhile, prices were falling 8 or 9% a year, deflation. Deflation is a disaster because it means that the income of the people producing those products is going down. Think of farm prices. Wheat got down to 15 cents a bushel. If the price of those products you're producing goes down, income of the sellers of those products is going down, and they're going to have trouble making their mortgage payments, which are not going down.
Right.
The mortgage payments are locked in on your farm or on your house. And if your income is going down, pretty soon you can't make your mortgage payment. So deflation is a disaster. And we were having the prices fell by 25 or 30% from 1929 to 33. And so anyway, the Fed made these gross policy mistakes. So it's a very interesting question. On balance, would they be better off just to tell the Fed, stay home, don't come to work, don't do anything. So that's good. It'd be a good doctoral dissertation to try to sort that out. Yeah. Okay.
That's great. And Faith is heading on to the FDIC, I believe. So
okay.
That's her future employment. So she'll have some great perspective on all these things.
Sheila Bear, of course. Yeah, Sheila Bear, of course, a Kansan from Wichita, I believe, was former head of the FDIC, I believe. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up for the students that are watching this. We showed I don't know if I assume you are, the television series, The Free to Choose. One of the things that Friedman does is he talks about the failure of the Fed, and then he interviews this fellow whose, I think, uncle was a bank president at Salt Lake City or Denver or somewhere out west. And they had this whole thing where how they dealt with a run on their bank. Initially, they gave people money very slowly and limited. And then the money came in from the Fed and they immediately were giving money as quickly as possible. So there was no line and no panic. And they worked with the other bank in town to do the same, and how they kind of, ebbed the panic. It's a really interesting video. It's something we may ask students to reflect on the exam because of the susceptibility of runs in the fractional reserve system of banking. And then I believe, and you might have seen me checking my phone real quick just to make sure I had my data correct. I think you referenced this in the book. The chairman up until the late 20s of the Fed was Ben Strong. Would you believe had he survived that possibly, and maybe that's Friedman that talks about this, maybe had he stayed on, that some of these problems would have been mitigated. There seems to be an opinion that he had a better grasp of monetary policy than the folks that followed him.
I think that's probably true. He was highly respected, and that left a void. He died in right before the Depression, I believe.
Yeah, 28. I was just checking it on my phone. Like I said.
Yeah, that's a good point. There was a void of leadership. In fact, there were people that thought these depressions are actually good for the economy. It helps wash out the speculators. These people were called liquidationists. They believe you had to liquidate the debtors, people who were borrowing money periodically. Also, by having depressions, you kind of hold down wages by throwing millions of people out of work.
Yeah.
There was this school of thought that depressions are a necessary feature of capitalism to kind of cleanse the system. The liquidationist theory. We don't look at it that way anymore.
No, we don't. I know you mentioned that this question here is a little bit more, future looking. So we aren't, this is a very interesting time we live in with a lot of, exogenous independent effects happening. But we'll go ahead and look at Cameron's question. Given that the trigger of our current economic downturn is very unique and different than the housing bubble in the 2008 recession, how would Dr. Thomas change his recommendations on Fed policy? How does he feel about the stimulus checks we receive? The Fed has been pretty loose here, trying to make funds available actively in response to this pandemic. So I don't know how much you want to talk about this question, but I'll go over to you.
I think Powell is doing a great job. He basically is taking all of the innovations that Bernanke put in the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 and adding aggressively on top of those. He is now buying mortgage bonds, not just mortgage-backed bonds and treasury bonds, but he's lending money to even small businesses. Traditionally, the Fed can only lend to banks, although Bernanke was working on the margin when he went a little bit beyond that to lend to large corporations. But Powell is, gone way beyond what Bernanke did. He's very aggressive. I think he's done a tremendous job. I'm sorry he comes under attack from the president so frequently, but I think he's done a terrific job. I think he's done an excellent job. Aggressively expanding the Fed's toolkit.
When you reflect back to the president's criticisms of Powell and the Fed, had they lowered rates when the president wanted it, they would have had, they didn't have a lot of tool chest as it was traditionally as this thing started, but certainly they would have been even more hamstrung had they, taken the president's advice on monetary policy, which, theoretically he should kind of stay out.
At that time, at the time he was being criticized, we didn't have this grant thing, of course. And the unemployment rate was already at 4%, and that's not usually the time you want to aggressively stimulate an economy. It got stimulated with the big tax cut of 2017, fiscal policy. We didn't really need monetary stimulus at that time.
Right. Yeah. Well, I've put together a PowerPoint that you put most of this together. I kind of edited it and was going to present it to the class tomorrow. We thought we might kind of go through some of this material and. Let me go to the full screen here because I know people will be looking at it a little differently. And so we can just kind of run through this and, maybe I'll come in with some comments as well. But I think we kind of planned this that we talk mostly about, the causes and effects of the Great Recession. And then obviously that'll give us some perspective to a degree on where we're at today. I think the data I saw today was another 3 million unemployment claims coming out. We're up to 33 million, I believe, since the start of this crisis, which is certainly, kind of overwhelming when you think about it. Tomorrow will be Jobs Friday. I'm involved. All of our students are involved with this Fed forecasting game. I should get you involved with it, Tom. It's challenging and a lot of fun. I projected the unemployment rate tomorrow at 12.9% on my estimate. I have no idea how that'll shake out, but it's a great unknown, and obviously that would be the highest unemployment rate we've seen, basically since the Great Depression. So there's a lot of places we can go with this, but I thought you kind of wanted to maybe start with an overview of the Great Recession, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Right, there was this huge loss of output. You know, what happened was you've all had the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model where you put the price level on the vertical axis, real GDP on the horizontal. We got a major downward shift of the aggregate demand curve. The stock market fell dramatically, erasing $7 trillion of wealth. House prices fell about 33%. And the major source of wealth of the median American household is the equity they have in their home. And when house prices fell 33% nationwide, a lot more than that in some cities, this caused a huge contraction of the equity that the families had in their house, a huge contraction of wealth. And when wealth goes down, there's going to be a reduction in consumer spending. And so there was this huge loss of output amounting to, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars. And it was borne mainly by the 8 million people who lost their jobs in the first 2 years. A lot of other people lost their homes. There were up to 15 million people underwater on their mortgage, where the value of the mortgage was higher than what they could sell their house for. And we got into this vicious cycle of the people underwater just sending in their keys to the bank, and then the bank would sell the house, causing house price to fall farther, causing more people to get underwater, and we got into this vicious cycle. And also this big loss of output and income caused fiscal crises in at least 46 out of the 50 states. States had to cut back on, you know, here in Missouri, the first thing they do when the revenue drops is cut higher education. Kansas isn't quite as bad in that regard. But when you have these fiscal crises, states, unlike the federal government, cannot typically deficit spend. So they have no alternative but slashing expenditures at the state level. And this can be a terrible thing, especially for people that are really in poverty, that are really struggling. It's a disaster. 46 out of 50 states had fiscal crises because of the severe recession, the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. This huge loss of wealth that we mentioned, $7 trillion reduction in equity in the family home, and another $7 trillion reduction in stock prices. Stock prices fell about 40%. Wiping out 7 trillion. So that's a $14 trillion contraction of household wealth, which feeds back and pulls down consumer spending substantially. We had the fiscal crisis for the US government, although that looks pretty modest compared to today. Today we're looking at $3 trillion deficits, which means at that rate, the national debt will double every 7 years. The national debt prior to this crisis was 22 trillion. It's going to go up 3 or 4 trillion this year, maybe more than that. But anyway, so the fiscal position of the federal government got much worse. So it's very important to find out what caused this disaster and try to set up things that make it less likely to happen again. Hyman Minsky, a great economist who had been at Berkeley and at Brown University, and ended up his career at Washington University in St. Louis, had this theory that we're going to look at here, theory of financial crises. While he was alive, he was not highly regarded. He's dead now, but while he was alive, economists thought he was a bit of a kook. He wasn't respected. They thought his theory was not realistic. But now that this financial crisis occurred, you know, his theory just to a T kind of explains what happened. It turned out to be very prescient in calling the shots on what happened in this financial crisis. And he said that fluctuations in the volume of credit is a key factor. And he talked about, let's see if we could go back, He said there's 3 types of financial arrangements that people undertake and business firms undertake. Hedge finance is a situation where the borrower is willing to borrow money and the lender are willing to accommodate only if the borrower and lender anticipate that the borrower will be able to make all payments of interest and principal out of the loan, so that the borrower will own that property, like a house, a mortgage that he has a mortgage on, free and clear after, say, 30 years. That's a traditional conservative type of finance. You don't buy a house unless you figure you're going to be able to make all the payments of principal and interest, so you own that thing free and clear, let's say with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. After 30 years, you've paid off all the principal and the interest, and you own that house free and clear. Otherwise, if you don't anticipate being able to do that, you're not going to enter into that mortgage. That's called hedge finance. Minsky has a second type of finance called speculative, where people are willing to take out a mortgage and buy a house or a farm or other investment project if you can make the interest payments, but not ever own it free and clear. You're willing to go ahead and buy that house if you figure, okay, I can make the interest payments on the mortgage, but I won't be able to pay down the principal. So I'll never own the house free and clear. And I'll have to refinance and take out another mortgage 30 years later because I haven't paid down the principal. In fact, that was the most common type of mortgage arrangement prior to the 1920s in the United States. Interest-only mortgages, which Minsky would call speculative finance. And then the third type of finance he called Ponzi Finance, where a borrower is willing to go ahead and buy a house, take out a mortgage, even if the borrower doesn't feel it can even make the interest payments fully from month to month, which means the principal will go up each year if you take out a mortgage and you can't make the full principal payment, much less, can't make the full interest payment, much less pay down part of the principal. That's called Ponzi Finance, and it's very risky because 20 years later, your mortgage balance is way bigger than it was when you started. And these things are likely to default. That's called Ponzi Finance in Minsky's terminology. Okay, Dan?
Yep.
The key hypothesis that Minsky came up with is if you have a long period of prosperity, this starts going to people's heads. They get euphoric about it. They get irrational. And this causes more and more people to not just be willing to take out the most conservative type of mortgage, but the speculative and the Ponzi type. And so Minsky claims that, and it rings true, given what happened, that over time, if you have a period of really sustained prosperity, more and more people are going to gravitate away from hedge finance towards speculative and Ponzi finance. So the amount of debt is going up rapidly. People are more heavily leveraged, and the financial system is going to be more and more unstable. And the crisis is going to happen. You're going to have a crisis. It's just a matter of what touches it off, according to Minsky. And that's exactly what happened. Minsky's theory explains the mortgage crisis very well. We had this 20-year period, I think Professor Kuester may have talked about this, called the Great Moderation, from the end of that 1981-82 recession. So from 1983 till about 2005 or 6, when house prices peaked out and started falling, we had an amazingly stable economy. There were two recessions in that 23-year period, 1991 and 2001. And those were the two mildest recessions of the 12 now that we've had since the 1930s. Real GDP fell only about 1% from peak to trough in each of those two recessions. And so this caused people to think, especially with Greenspan at the Fed, and Greenspan was considered a genius at sorting out all the data and figuring out when do we raise interest rates, when do we lower interest rates. And they wrote a book on him called The Maestro, conducting the US economy, kind of like an orchestra conductor is conducting the orchestra. And he was considered a genius, and people have started to say, hey, he's cured the business cycle. We're probably not going to have any more recessions. Well, this is the type of attitude when this becomes widespread. People get overconfident, they get cocky about things, they're willing to lever themselves, they're willing to go to these more speculative type of endeavors. And this sets the stage for extreme risky behavior, especially in the housing market. And when the house prices crashed, we got the great financial crisis.
Just for some perspective here, Tom, you probably recall this. I came to K-State in 2004, and I was renting there for a while, and eventually got a bit of a promotion and bought a home. But we were talking through this time. This wasn't we'll talk more about the boom and bust in housing prices, and certainly Manhattan was less affected by this than Las Vegas or these places where there was tremendous amounts of speculation. But our discussions kind of convinced me to hold off on buying my first home in 2006, 2007, because there appeared to be kind of a nationwide bubble. So this wasn't, a shock to folks that were paying some attention to this. If people have seen the movie The Big Short, you watch it or read the book, you see about these folks who profited, from the bust of these mortgage-backed securities and things. But you were perceptive about this at the time and recognized that this was an unsustainable level of inflation and home prices when it was going on.
Well, one of the indicators of a bubble is when a family or an individual that buys a house is willing to take out a mortgage in which they're spending maybe 50 or 60% of their monthly income just to pay that mortgage balance. The rule of thumb used to be 30% is a prudent. Don't overextend yourself. If you're paying 30% of your take-home pay to make your monthly payment, that's okay. But don't get up to 50 or 60%. You're getting overextended. And a lot of families were buying houses in which they were using 50 or 55, 60% sometimes of their monthly paycheck just to pay the mortgage. That's very risky. You're going to be vulnerable when that happens. Your car breaks down or something, you're going to have trouble.
Well, and then as you mentioned, the number of mortgages that were not traditional mortgages was increasing as well. All these people with these adjustable rate mortgages and interest-only loans and things was also increasing.
Right. So you get to a cycle now where people have really leveraged the heck out of things, and you're at the apex of the cycle, and you're going to have a crash. When you get people paying 60% of their monthly paycheck, and some of the other indicators that suggest people are overextended. One indicator is the ratio of what you could rent a house for to the price of it, or upside down, the ratio of the price of the house to the monthly rent. And if that price of the house relative to the monthly rent is twice the norm, I mean, that'd be an indicator, hey, you're probably in a bubble. And that's one of the indicators that indicated we're in a bubble, along with people paying a huge amount of their monthly paycheck to pay their mortgage balance. But you're going to have a crash now when you get the people this extended and this overconfident, this euphoric. You're going to have a crash, and it could be some General Motors files for bankruptcy. I mean, that'd be an extreme example, which could cause a crash. Could be just any rumor, which might not even be true. It could be the central bank raises interest rates to try to reduce the speculation in housing. That would cause some people that have these variable rate mortgages their monthly payments would go up, and they might therefore default. Or you might just have a spontaneous crash. This just starts falling. House prices just start falling, and that's going to trigger a lot of other people having to sell their house because they're going to be underwater. And at some point, if you're underwater $80,000 on your mortgage, just send in the keys to the bank and say, I'm sorry, you gave me this mortgage. It's your problem. You got the house, but you also got the mortgage. And they can't come after me and garnish my paycheck. That's what a lot of people did, voluntarily defaulted when they were underwater by a big amount. So we're going to have a crash. Here's what's really interesting. The reckless behavior obviously increased. It used to be that the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. I remember when I bought a house in Manhattan 30 years ago, I went down there to what is now Commerce Bank, used to be Union National Bank down there on Points. And that guy sat me down for 2 hours. And he said, okay, I want to see your tax returns for the last 3 years. I want to see your letter that you're hired at K-State. I want to see what your monthly pay is. You got to show me your pay stubs. I want banking information, etc. 2 hours he sat me down there before he finally said, okay, you're clearly qualified. I'll give you, 30-year fixed rate mortgage. These things gave way to what they call undocumented mortgages, which are really what the nickname was liar loans. They would just ask the potential borrower, what's your income? 100,000 a year. Okay, we'll get you in here on this mortgage with just 2% down payment. And the reason they did that is they knew they were going to sell off that mortgage to be put into a bond within the next 2 or 3 weeks. So they didn't have much at risk, whether you're going to be able to make your payments or not. The pattern of incentives had changed because of this new financial innovation, new financial technology, these mortgage-backed bonds and derivatives related to those, such as collateralized debt obligations, et cetera. So that was one of these undocumented mortgages, liar loans, low and zero down payment mortgages. In San Francisco in 2005, half the mortgages that were issued only had to put down 2% down payment. That was the median down payment, that you put down when you buy a house. And I think in some cases you could buy a house with zero down payment because there was this widespread assumption that house prices would keep going up. And thirdly, these variable rate mortgages had teaser rates. They called them 228 mortgages. In the first 2 years, we can get you in at 2.5% mortgage rate. But after the second year, we have the right to bump up that rate as much as 2 percentage points per year, depending on what's happening to interest rates out there in the economy. And people didn't read the fine print. They thought they were locked in, I guess. I mean, buyer beware. It's the people's fault that took these out, who later defaulted when after the second year, they were told, hey, your monthly payment is going to go from $600 a month to $825 a month. Well, I can't make that payment. And so these things turned out to be a disaster, these 228 mortgages. And even some of these negative amortization mortgages loans were made, this Ponzi Finance, which, as Minsky predicted, a lot of those, most of those will eventually go bad. So millions of people, got overextended. They bought second homes. They bought homes that turned out to be more expensive, that they really couldn't afford, especially if they took out a variable rate mortgage. It seems to me that with this change in financial technology, the securitization, this mortgage-backed bond phenomenon, really changed the whole pattern of incentives. And I wonder why Greenspan wasn't really up to speed on that, and why he didn't let that influence his thinking. Gramlich, who was a dean of business at the University of Michigan and a very good economist, he was on the board of governors. He was an expert in mortgage finance, wrote a book on it. And he was on the board of governors at the same time as Greenspan. And he went in to see Mr. Greenspan. I'm not sure exactly what year it was, 2001, maybe 2001, somewhere in there.
Yeah, it says around 2000 here. Yeah.
Yeah. He went in there to Mr. Greenspan, said, Mr. Greenspan, there's some really crazy behavior going on out there in California. We got this strawberry picker whose income is $14,000 a year, was just granted a $700,000 mortgage with no questions asked. Some of these lesser type of mortgage lenders who are not subject to any regulations, Mr. Greenspan, maybe you ought to ask Congress for some authority to regulate some of these mortgage lenders. They're irresponsible. They're making loans to people that clearly are going to have trouble making the payments. But Greenspan really wasn't interested in pursuing that. He said free markets are always better than government intervention, which usually they are, but maybe not always. So anyway, Professor Kuester has an article about that that students can access.
Yeah. I thought you had initially put this in, and I thought I'd just give a little bit of citation there. Yeah. So.
Great.
So I think, are we going to go back in the slides now? I think, is that accurate? Yeah. So while we're doing that, I mean, another thing that comes up pretty frequently, and I may even ask it on the exam, is this. Let's see. I think this is where we want to go. Are these ninja loans? That's always a term I like to throw out to folks, and it's easy to remember. So the concept behind that, and there were several of those out there. Famously in The Big Short, they talk about the dog getting the mortgage and stuff like that. But no income, no job, no assets, but you can get a mortgage. And I think Tom will talk a little bit more about the originate to distribute method, which he already has alluded to. That, again, that made it possible. They weren't checking people the way Dr. Thomas got checked when he took out his mortgage, because the accountability had changed dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's several forces I think that contribute to these twin bubbles: bubble in the amount of credit and house prices, which are interrelated. The easier house credit is, the more people can buy houses, the demand goes up, and the more the price will go up. And then on the other hand, the more the price goes up, the more feedback there is to develop, ways to get more people involved in buying a house. And so you got the two-way, you got these twin bubbles. So the amount of credit, which Minsky emphasized, feeds in and helps drive up the price of these houses. But the various contributing forces besides that, there was this view that house prices can't fall. They hadn't fallen nationwide since the 1930s. So from the 1930s into 2006 or 7, when they did start falling, what do you got, 70 years there, and people developed the attitude, house prices are different. They aren't like steel, they aren't like stock prices, they aren't like the price of corn. They can't fall. There's something about house prices. They can slow down or stay constant for a while, but nationwide, house prices are different. They can't fall. We have a fixed amount of land in this country, and in any country. There's a robust income elasticity of demand for houses. So as living standards rise, the demand for land and for houses is going to go up, and that makes house prices different. They're not going to fall. You don't have to worry about that. There's no risk. There's no downside risk. You buy a house and its price goes down. So that was this widespread view, and you can see why that would develop after 70 some odd years since the 30s, since house prices had fallen. And even then, they didn't fall as much as they did after this bubble collapsed in 2006. And secondly, force was this imprudent and reckless behavior by lenders and borrowers, degradation of lending standards, and in my view, at least, absence of reasonable oversight in view of this change in financial technology. The mortgage-backed bonds and the collateralized debt obligations, which were derivatives of the mortgage-backed bonds, and all kinds of esoteric instruments like that came on stream. A lot of physics PhDs were designing all these exotic, esoteric financial instruments that nobody knew what the hell, what they were. There was a CDO, and then there was a CDO squared, and we got carried away with. Anyway, in view of this new financial technology, it seems to me like we didn't have enough oversight by the regulatory authorities. Then there was, I think, either incompetent or fraudulent behavior by the credit rating agencies. There's three major credit rating agencies. Standard & Poor's is the biggest one, and then Moody's, and then Fitch. And they rate all of these different mortgage-backed bonds along with just regular corporate bonds and municipal bonds to give a rating. And they developed an attitude, if we don't dumb down our ratings, we're not going to get business. We're not going to, the person will go to another rating agency. In many cases, you had to be rated AAA. If you wanted pension funds, for example, to be eligible to buy these mortgage-backed bonds, they had to be AAA. Otherwise, they're not allowed to buy these. China would not buy these probably if they were not AAA. And so there was a tremendous pressure to get these bonds rated AAA. And these credit rating agencies started dumbing down their rating standards so they would get the business. You get a big fee for rating these mortgage-backed bonds. And the fee is paid by the investment banks that develop the mortgage-backed bonds. There's kind of a conflict of interest there. We need a different way of financing the ratings other than having the buyer of the ratings being the ones that pays for it. There's kind of a conflict.
Well, and I think you mentioned this in the book, Tom. I remember when I was a kid, I forget some of the publications my grandfather would take, but investors used to pay for that information because it wasn't as readily available. And you can correct me if I'm mistaken, but with the advent of the internet and easily shared information, that source of revenue went away for these agencies. So they became increasingly reliant on who should have been, the agency should have been the customers of the banks, but they were more customers of the the banks themselves. I'm probably saying that wrong, but the dependence changed.
That's a good point. Yeah. So we had that problem there. And then a nearly unbounded supply of credit. When you think about this innovation of these mortgage-backed bonds, in the old days, not only mortgage-backed bonds, but also we had these collateralized debt obligations where you would take these mortgage-backed bonds and split it into three tranches, a French name for slice, And the top tranche would get the first, in case of problems with the mortgage-backed bond, the top tranche would get the payment, be the first to be paid. And therefore, that tranche, called the superior tranche, would have the lowest yield on it because it was risk-free, basically. You get paid before the other tranches. And that was bought by pension funds and others. Then there was an intermediate tranche that was bought by insurance companies, which were not required to buy AAA rated. These are the intermediate tranche gets paid after the superior tranche gets paid on these CDOs. So those didn't pay as much of a yield. They were slightly riskier and they were rated A. And then you had this third tranche. You don't get paid off. If there's problems with that mortgage-backed bond, you're the last to get paid. And therefore it would have to have the highest yield because it's much riskier. So they developed all these really complicated derivative securities from these mortgage-backed bonds. Then we have the emergence of the shadow banking system, hedge funds, investment banks, auction rate securities, etc. So there's more institutions involved in creating credit for the housing market. And then we had this search for investment outlets by China, India, countries that had run surpluses in their balance of trade with the US, had accumulated huge cash holdings, and they started buying a heavy amount of these mortgage-backed bonds and these CDOs. So there's tremendous demand for these. And in the old days, when a savings and loan ran out of money because it had used up all of its savings depositors. Here's a good example: Manhattan Federal Savings and Loan. They issue savings deposits on the liability side of their balance sheet, basically. Maybe borrow a little bit from other sources, and then issue mortgages. They're required to put 85% of their assets into mortgages. But as soon as they use up all the funds that they've raised on the liability side, the sources of funds to give mortgages, they're out of money. So there was clearly a finite supply of mortgages available. Once we switch to this mortgage-backed bonds, there's potentially an infinite supply of mortgage money available. As long as there's any institution or a foreign government like China, or institution like a pension fund, who finds these mortgage-backed bonds attractive, there's no limit on the amount of mortgages that can potentially be made. And so that's a whole different ballgame about the supply side of the mortgage market that happened when we went to these mortgage-backed bonds. Okay, this one shows, okay. One indicator of a bubble would be the amount of mortgage debt relative to take-home pay. And you can see that went up somewhat smoothly from the 80s on into about 1998 when this housing bubble really got going. And you can see that an upward explosion. And this is aggregate mortgage debt divided by aggregate household disposable income. That'd be kind of a sign of a bubble when you get that much debt compared to income in the aggregate in the United States. And there were other signals of bubbles, such as, people putting down 50% of their monthly paycheck to pay their monthly mortgage. Okay, Dan. Okay, this is a great graph because it shows the volume of these mortgage-backed bonds that were issued from 2000 to 2007, especially. And you can see a stair-step increase, maxing out in 2005 at 1,200 billion. If you aggregate everything from 2000 to 2007, it comes to, I think, 5,200 billion, $5.2 trillion of mortgage-backed bonds. That's an awful lot of mortgage money. You can see this was a tremendous innovation, which had backfired by feeding into this housing bubble. A huge amount, 5,200 billion of mortgage-backed securities. As house prices started falling in 2008, people realized, hey, these mortgage-backed bonds are risky. By 2008, house prices were falling rapidly and people wouldn't buy them. So they stopped issuing. They cut way back on the issuance of these mortgage-backed bonds after housing prices started crashing. But that fit into the bubble.
I think it's worth mentioning that, when these were first the innovation, that the type of subprime lending wasn't nearly as prevalent as it became later. So the logic behind a mortgage-backed security was sound initially. You have a lot of these people who are going to take tremendous action not to have their home foreclosed upon, who were initially pretty responsible borrowers, and then you're diversifying your risk. So if 1 out of 200 people has a external catastrophe and they have their home foreclosed on, you're protected from that risk because you've diversified. But eventually the number of borrowers and the types of borrowers changed dramatically, as we alluded to earlier. So they became risky. They initially were pretty innovative and safe.
People were making a lot of profits, mortgage lenders and so on, and they started scrounging around. We got to find more people to give a mortgage to. And pretty soon they were giving it to people who were very vulnerable about being able to make their payment. So that's a good point. Leverage in the system, yeah.
This is just something that we would bring up in the class, and the idea of debt to equity ratios that were increasing. So we'll show that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this shows a ramping up of leverage by the big investment banks. These were 4 of the biggest ones: Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, and Morgan Stanley. In 2004, the investment banks went to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which sets capital requirements, which is pretty close to the reciprocal of these ratios. Capital requirement would be the amount of capital or equity of a bank or a lending institution relative to total assets, amount of capital relative to total assets. The reciprocal of that is the leverage ratio. A bank can finance itself either with capital or equity or with debt. And this shows that the ratio of debt to equity, debt to the capital of the institution, was ramping up. They were leveraging themselves much more highly. And you can see that especially in 2006 and 7, there's a big jump in this. Anyway, in 2004, these firms went to Securities and Exchange Commission and said, hey, we got an 8% capital requirement. We're really safe institutions. How about cutting that to 4%? 4% capital to total assets, which means the leverage is the reciprocal of that, basically, 25 to 1. Take the reciprocal of 4% versus the reciprocal of 8%. The capital requirement ratio of capital to total assets requirement was 8%, and they got it cut to 4%. The head of the SEC went along with that because they appeared to be in good condition at that time. That was 2004. And so they ramped up leverage, the amount of debt relative to equity, which is very close to just the reciprocal of the capital to total assets ratio, because debt is 90% of total assets. And so this indicates a huge ramping up of leverage, the amount of debt relative to capital or debt relative to equity of these investment banks. And so that fed strongly into the bubble.
Yeah, a lot of these folks appear to be at 3%.
Yeah, there were some at 3% there for a while. Some of the biggest commercial banks. These are investment banks, but I remember 1 or 2 of the biggest commercial banks had their ratio down to 3% before house prices started collapsing. Right.
Again, this is just something, if I was presenting to the class, that we would ask people to think about. Hopefully, we've shown enough information to illustrate that, and we'll go ahead and do so.
Yeah, I might point out we don't show it here, but if house prices are rising 5 or 10% a year, and you can leverage yourself by making a small down payment, take a big mortgage and put a small down payment. If house prices are rising 5%, or especially if they're rising 10% a year, you're going to make a tremendous rate of return because you're leveraged with debt and the price of the house is going up. Let's say 10% a year, it would double every 7 years at that rate. You make a small down payment, put down $20,000, buy a $200,000 house, so you're leveraged 10 to 1 more or less, or 9 or 10 to 1. And if that house is going up 5 or 10% a year, your original down payment, you're going to get a tremendous rate of return on that. And you'll get a higher rate of return if you leverage yourself more heavily, as long as house prices are rising, especially if they're rising 5 or 10% a year. This shows that 2 different measures, 20 large cities, New York, Chicago, Dallas, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami, etc. They were rising at a rapid rate. Starting back here, they're rising 10% a year, 12%, and a little bit slower. There was a recession in here in 2001, so demand for housing slowed down. But then it was off to the races, and 10%, 15, 16% a year. At 16%, house prices double in about 4.25 years. If it goes, take the rule of 70, 70 over 16,
Right.
about 4.5 years, your house price is going to double. So you put down a small down payment, take out a big mortgage, and you've made a heck of a rate of return on your money. And I figured if you make a 2% down payment and house prices are going up 10% a year, you're going to make about almost 60% a year on your because you put a small down payment, you leveraged, and you benefit from benefit from being in debt by leveraging yourself and getting a really high rate of return. It gets magnified. And so people started to view housing as an investment, not just a place to live, but a way to get wealthy. People started to figure, I should make a small down payment, take the biggest mortgage where I can make those monthly payments and get away with it, and I'm going to get wealthy doing this. Let's buy a house as an investment, not as just a place to live. And it made sense during this period. But once house prices start falling, of course, you're in big trouble. And this fed into the bubble, this psychology. A house is an investment, not just a place to live, but it's an investment. It's a way to accumulate wealth. And again, the median U.S. household, the biggest single source of their wealth is the equity they have in their home. And so that became a widespread view. Hey, this is a way to accumulate wealth. Make a small down payment, take out the biggest mortgage you can make the payments on, get yourself a really nice house, and it's going to go up, and you're going to accumulate wealth.
And just to reiterate, because I think most of the students are aware of this, but again, if you think about a 10% average rate of acceleration or inflation in a home price, that will double about every 7 years. We should remember the rule of 70 from our earlier classes. If you take 70 divided by the growth rate, or 72, you may have heard of it as the rule of 72, which is actually probably a little bit more accurate when we start dealing with some of these larger numbers. That gives you the approximate amount of time it's going to take for an asset accelerating at a constant rate to double. So 70 divided by 10 is 7. So approximately every 7 years, you have a doubling of the value of the asset. So if you bought a $200,000 home, whether it be with 10% down, or say it's 10% down, which would be 5%, in 7 years, you have an asset, and maybe you're doing one of these interest-only loans, you have an asset that's worth $400,000 that was initially worth $200,000. Well, if you sell that, you can pay off your what you owe, but you're effectively, you have $210,000 on a $10,000 initial investment after that thing sells. So you can see the appeal of that. And I think most of us were following Dr. Thomas. Some people are more aware of that rule than others. So I wanted to just stress that.
Yeah. So this shows for individual cities, the percentage increase, so 180% for Miami. That means it didn't quite triple. It more than doubled. 100% would double it. This is the percentage increase in house prices. So 180% didn't quite triple. If it got up to 200%, it would have tripled in price in about a 6 or 7 year period. Miami's way up there, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Las Vegas. Las Vegas experienced the biggest drop. Later, we'll see. But you've got at least 2, 4, 6, or 7 house places that they more than doubled in a short period of 6 years. And nationwide, comp 10 is 10 large cities. On the average, more than doubled because it went up above 120. So it, more than doubled. And also in the 20 large city sample of large cities, it more than doubled in about a 6 year period. Okay. This shows what a $100,000 house, how it appreciated in a 4 year period from January 2002 to June of 2006. House prices peaked out at about June or a couple months earlier in 2006. They peaked at different dates in different cities. But again, Miami, 100,000 went up to 225, et cetera. This is somewhat similar to the previous graph in terms of its implications. Yeah. So this is the real U.S. home price going back to 1890. So if you looked at the nominal home price, this spike would look a lot bigger over here starting in 1998. But even then, the real price went up, index from about 110 to a little over 200. That's adjusted for inflation. And then, if we could have avoided that spike upward, we would have avoided the spike downward, which was disastrous for the U.S. economy and for tens of millions of Americans. Okay.
You
This is
referenced
one
this
of,
earlier, yeah.
yeah, this is an indicator of a bubble. If the ratio of the price of a house to what it would rent for is spiking higher and higher, that's indicative of a likely bubble. And you can see that peaked out in 2006 when house prices peaked out, and then it came back to a more normal level as house prices crashed. So that's a sign of a bubble. So Minsky's theory, yeah.
We went through that, so.
Do that, yeah.
And so here's the downside.
Yeah, this showed later. I updated this to a couple of years later than the 2009. Las Vegas, where is it? Okay, yeah, it went down. Yeah, okay. Later on, it went down by as much as 62%, which meant that a $500,000 house in Las Vegas in 2006, by 2012, was down to 190,000, from 500 down to 190. That was the biggest percentage drop in the country, Las Vegas. Even here it shows that, but when you extend it a few years longer, they kept going down after 2009. So, these huge crashes, often falling in half. And nationwide, I think 34% over here for 10 big cities and for 20 big cities. That had never happened before in the United States, that kind of a drop in house prices.
And I guess this is just kind of anecdotal, but I'm a bit of a poker player. I like to try to play poker. Right now with the crisis, they're saying they're not going to allow more than 4 people at a poker table. I'm not in any hurry to get back to Vegas anyway. But when I would go in about 2010, 2011, if you're sitting at a poker table, inevitably anywhere from 3 to 6 of the 9 people at the table were a former real estate agent, if you asked them. I mean, all these people thought they were just going to keep, flipping these mortgages and get rich quick. And that market went down in a hurry. So it was interesting to observe.
Flip this house. There was a TV program called Flip This House. Buy it when it's under contract to be built, and then sell it after it's built for 20%, 25% increase in the house price. Okay.
So again, this should be pretty straightforward when we think about how the investment banks we showed earlier were investing in mortgage-backed securities and other assets.
Now, even though they created these, they held a lot on their books, thinking they were tremendous investments, and that turned out, of course, to be a huge, huge mistake. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that Lehman Brothers, run by Dick Fuld, he was caught holding a whole lot of mortgage-backed bonds that they had created, thinking these are great investments. Let's just hang on to them. And he never sold them. They went down in price, and he said, well, if I sell them, I'm still solvent. But if I hold them, they're going to go back up in price. And so I'm just going to hang on to them. That turned out to be his downfall when he held on to them. The
movie Too Big to Fail, I think, is generally accurate, and it's not flattering of Dick Fuld as he goes through this, and he has no concept of sunk costs. If you watch the movie, he's saying, well, just not too long ago our stock was worth this and now it's worth this, why would I sell? We can't think about that if we understand economics, unless there's a fundamental reason to think that the stock will bounce back. He just kind of thought, well, it's always been a good stock, it's going to have to bounce back, and it didn't, and that's why they went bankrupt.
He was kind of an ornery guy, and he didn't have a lot of friends in Wall Street or in the regulatory things. If it had been somebody else, they might have bailed him out. They might have made sure he didn't fail.
Well, they show, that he was trying to work with B of A, and it turns out that Merrill Lynch gets that deal, and probably partially because they seem to be better people to work with. If you kind of interpret the movie a little bit. I don't know if we wanted to go through this one or not, Tom.
Well, this one just very briefly. This just shows if the mortgage-backed bonds drop in price, dollar for dollar that they drop is going to come right out of your capital account, because this side of the balance sheet doesn't change. But when house prices collapse, the value of these mortgage-backed bonds, what they would sell for, goes down from 400 to I forgot what our assumption is here.
You said 250, I think. looks
Okay,
like.
so they drop 150, so their capital would go down 150 billion to 30.5, I guess. And therefore their capital ratio is down to 1.5%. They're getting close to being insolvent. And that's what happened to a lot of these banks, investment banks and regular banks. They got caught holding these things when their prices collapsed. And that knocked out a big part of their capital. And a lot of times people didn't know, this market kind of shut down there for a while, and people didn't know what the hell those prices were. And they didn't know if some of these firms were insolvent or not. And that caused a lot of problems. The market shut down. Okay, this shows a wealth effect. We had the tremendous bubble in the stock market in the late 90s. The build out of the internet, the US was at the forefront of information technology. 1995 to 2000, we got into a virtuous cycle. Bill Clinton was president. He was smart and he was also very lucky. But we got this surge of productivity in those years between 1995 and 2000. Output per hour was going up 3% a year. And we were at the forefront of information technology. The rest of the world wanted to invest in the US. And during Clinton's 2 terms, unemployment fell all consecutive 8 years. Every year, unemployment fell, unemployment rate. And the inflation rate also fell in 6 of the 8 years. So at the end of that 8 years of a tremendous economic expansion, the inflation rate was lower than at the beginning. Partly because of the rest of the world wanted to get in on the action and invest in US assets. So the dollar exchange rate, the dollar appreciated sharply, lowering the cost of imports, holding down inflation in the US. Plus the surge of productivity tends to hold down inflation. You can go ahead and give a 4% wage increase if productivity is going up 3% a year. And we got this virtuous cycle going on in the late 90s, and the stock market took off and it ended up being in a terrific bubble. The price earnings ratio of the S&P 500 got up to 44 in 1999 or early 2000 before the market crashed. The biggest bubble in US history, much bigger than the bubble of the late 90s, the stock market bubble. And so bubbles are always going to pop, and that one popped and wiped out $7 trillion of wealth. $7 or $8 trillion of wealth. But then it's back to the races again. The stock market went back up again in the next 6 or 7 years. House prices went up. So there was just this big wealth effect from 2000 to about 2006. And people were wealthier. And,
well, and you see 9/11 here, I think, also as one of this big dip, would be my guess. So that's 2001.
Yeah.
And people were, you know, there was a lot of panic there, and once that subsided, you started to see a quick recovery to where we were.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. Okay, so investment spending, you know, why are you going to build a new house when A, the unemployment rate has been going up, you're in a recession by 2007, and when B, you can buy a repossessed house for a 30% discount to what it would cost to build a new one. So investment spending started crashing when house prices started falling.
And this, just to point out, this was a question on the recent quiz that we had in senior seminar, and a few people put consumption, and I said, well, it's relative to where it was. It's not overall spending, it's percentage of GDP, and you see this investment spending falling from something like 17 to 12%, give or take. I could be off a little bit, but the percentage change was pretty dramatic overall in investment, and the driver of that is this housing purchases.
Yeah, of course, housing counts as investment, as residential fixed investment, and that fell dramatically, more than in half, way more than in half, maybe 75%, I believe, or something like that. So that was a major cause of the downturn. Here's the change in the amount of employment. And just to put you in a better mood, after this ended, we had 10 years, something like how many consecutive quarters, how many consecutive months, 120 consecutive months of positive job growth until what, two or 3 months ago when this virus came.
I think we were, maybe 128, if I had to guess, somewhere in there. Yeah.
10 years where a little more than 10 years where
a little more than 10 years, yeah.
Positive job growth averaging 160,000 per month. But in here, we were losing 600,000 jobs a month for about 6 months in 2008, and then at the beginning of 2009, especially in 2008. So that aggregates to over 8 million jobs lost in just a couple of years, maybe 10 million by the time you get over here to the end of 2009. At least 8 million loss of jobs. That was a huge.
And as I'm checking my numbers here, because I sent this to myself earlier, if you look at, again, we're looking at somewhere around 30 million people that have filed for benefits since the beginning of this crisis. And so obviously the hope is the recovery will be much more rapid because it's based on this exogenous effect. But I know, neither one of us are soothsayers, and it's going to be difficult to see. These are going to be so much determined by external factors, how much, how quickly we see a lot of these jobs come back online.
There's a lot of pent-up demand. The only thing I spend money on is food.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave the house.
Yeah.
At my age, I can't afford to get this
Yeah.
COVID-19 thing. So it's hard to spend money. So people have built up savings. They've got pent-up demand, and if we can get out of this deal without a recurrence, I think we get a pretty strong recovery. But we're going to try to do it gradually, so it'll be spaced out, I guess, over time. Okay, what would we do to make this thing less likely to happen again? Because as Minsky said, people have this psychological thing. They get in these euphoric periods after a long period of prosperity. I don't think we're in any trouble in the next 4 or 5 years of another one of these crises, but 10 years out, 8 years out, it could happen again. How to reduce the likelihood of that? Higher capital requirements would mean banks have more of their own capital, their own money at stake. They would have more to lose if they fail, and it might make them more risk averse if they have more. If capital is only 2% of total assets, they're leveraged so damn much that they aren't losing that much. If they have 10% capital to total assets, they got more of their own equity, more of their own money at stake. And also it'd take a much bigger shock to make a bank insolvent. And so I think Dodd-Frank raised capital requirements and also did some other things to reduce the amount of risky behavior. A lot of people got tricked on their mortgages. They were ignorant. They didn't read the fine print. They didn't see that the good chance that their monthly payments are going to go up. Elizabeth Warren is a hawk on trying to force people to be more clear making these mortgages, exactly what is the risk to the borrower. So the borrower becomes well aware of that. We had some naive borrowers. Skin in the game. Why not force these institutions to keep 20% of these mortgages on their books? As it is, they don't give a damn. They sell off the mortgage and it's somebody else's problem. Let them keep 20% of those mortgages on their books. Then they've got skin in the game. They got something to lose. They've got more incentive to scrutinize that borrower and make sure that the likelihood is very high the borrower is going to keep making payments. So that makes obvious sense to change the pattern of incentives. Maybe reform the compensation system on Wall Street. Apparently the way it worked in its build up to the crisis, if you ramp up risk and you're a manager on Wall Street, if things go well, you get a $5 million bonus if you're real high up in the organization. Maybe a $50,000 bonus if you're way low in the organization. And if things go well, you get this bonus. If things go bad, you usually get zero bonus. They don't claw it back. How about making these bonuses based on what's the average rate of return over the last 5 years instead of just the last 1 year, or even the last 10 years? Change the pattern of incentives, either that or claw back. Of course, a lot of them wouldn't be able to pay if you tried to claw it back. So give these bonuses to the officers over an average, over a period of 5-year return that they made, or a 10-year period instead of each year, given that they don't claw back the bonus when they have a losing year. So that gives incentive for the organization to ramp up risk, ramp up leverage, because you're not going to have to sacrifice anything. You don't have to pay back anything if you have a bad year. That would be helpful. Too big to fail is a big problem, I think. We've got the 5 largest banks in this country, the 5 largest commercial banks, have over half of all the deposits in the nation. Jamie Dimon's bank, JP Morgan Chase, has $2.6 trillion of assets. How about trying to give an incentive for these big banks to voluntarily downsize? How about putting in a graduated system of capital requirements so that they would voluntarily downsize. If you get up over 1.5 trillion in assets, you know, you're going to have a 12% capital requirement. If you can downsize, maybe you'll have an 8% capital requirement. That would raise the rate of return of these institutions. They wouldn't leverage themselves. They could leverage themselves more if they're smaller. How about a progressive capital requirement, and then they would voluntarily downsize, or a progressive tax rate? You know, if you're JP Morgan's bank, you're going to be, instead of a 37% tax rate, you're being a 42%. Give them an incentive to voluntarily downsize. Don't just break them up. Give them an incentive to downsize. It seems to me that would mean you don't have to bail out these firms. If they know they're too big to fail, they just have an incentive to take advantage of that and take more risk, putting the rest of us at risk when the system collapses and unemployment goes way up. Number 5, think about this, what I believe sounds like corruption in the rating agencies. Have these firms that want to be rated pay a fee to some organization, maybe even part of some government organization or something, and then the government gets the ratings, and take away this conflict of interest and get more objective ratings. Nobody did their due diligence. The rating agencies didn't do their due diligence at looking at those individual mortgages, and then the public didn't do their due diligence. They just took it for granted whatever the rating agency rated. Those were bona fide, legitimate ratings. And as we talked about, there was this dumbing down of the ratings, and almost anything was rated AAA there toward the end.
The 5 and 6 kind of go together, yeah.
Okay, so in conclusion, you know, this financial crisis had tremendous costs. Tens of millions of people suffered as a result of this. We need to try to make changes that would reduce the frequency and the severity of future crises. We're going to have these crises periodically, according to Minsky, and I think he's right. Just human nature, psychology. People get into these periods of euphoria, things go to their head, they start ramping up risk. I think the cause of this crisis was primarily in the banking sector and the financial sector. Although the government was culpable also. Greenspan kept interest rates unusually low after that 2001 recession. He kept that rate down at about 1.5 or 2% on the federal funds rate, even a year or 2 or 3 after the end of that recession of 2001, and that fed into these variable rate with teaser rate mortgage rates. And so I kind of wonder why he kept the rates that low that long. I didn't criticize him at the time, I remember, so I'm better not criticize him now. He didn't know.
Well, inflation was low. I mean, that's part of it, is that you know, there wasn't really that much concern about inflation if you look back in time, which would be, you know, usually the impetus to consider raising rates, but it did create this bubble, no doubt.
Yeah, with hindsight, we wish the rates had been higher, and we wouldn't have these people getting in at these 228 mortgages at an initial rate of 2.25%. Yeah. We had those well-intentioned efforts to broaden the scope of ownership for people who in the past would not have any chance of owning a home. I think home ownership has positive externalities. You know, if you're renting a house and the neighborhood is not going to be as good, you don't have as much incentive to keep the lawn up and, you know, keep the place up. If you own a house, you know, I think the crime rates are going to be lower in those kind of neighborhoods. It seems to me there's positive externalities associated with ownership. So it's a good idea, but it would have been much better to just make grants to poor people. So let's say you got to make a 15% down payment. You're not getting in with 2% down payment. We'll give you a grant to help you make that down payment. If you have really low income, and if there are positive externalities associated with home ownership. But we can't have you buying a house with a 2% down payment, because you're going to get underwater. You know, you run the risk of getting underwater, and then we get this crash that has tremendous negative externalities. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac decided, you know, they were originally created to issue bonds to increase the supply of mortgages. And since they were originally associated with the government, they could issue these bonds at a low mortgage rate and turn around, therefore, and increase the supply curve of mortgages and keep mortgage rates lower, subsidy to the home buyers. You have lower mortgage rates. But when we got into this bubble and this behavior by the investment banks, pretty soon Fannie and Mae decided, hey, we're going to try to see how much profits we can make. And so they ramped up their risk tremendously and started engaging in dubious behavior. The head of it ended up in prison. Franklin Raines, I believe was his name. So they got the idea, hey, we need to compete with the investment banks to see how much profits we could make. But they were originally created to be an organization which subsidized homeowners by issuing these bonds at a low mortgage rate and therefore a low rate of interest to the public. And then then we'll use that to grant millions of mortgages. We'll increase the supply curve of mortgages, holding down mortgage rates. They lost their mission and started to emulate the investment banks and seeing how much profit they can make. And a lot of shady behavior started going on. So the government kind of nationalized those and still hadn't decided what to do with Fannie and Freddie. Probably to end up privatizing perhaps. And I think the big problem from the way I see things, given this change in financial technology, we need to update the regulatory structure to allow for the change in, the change in incentives about making loans. The financial services industry has very great political influence in the U.S., hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more than that, annually to politicians. And so they don't want a lot of financial reforms. Yeah, some people think that when Henry Paulson agreed to bail out these big firms in 2008 and 9, when Lehman Brothers failed, September 15th, 2008, a day that lives in infamy in financial literature. Maybe he should have extracted some kind of agreements when he did that, but that's second guessing. They were just trying to save the system at that point. And people were really angry that they bailed out the banks, but they didn't bail out Main Street. So I think that's one reason you're seeing the Fed now trying to bail out Main Street. They're making loans to small businesses, in some cases that they don't have to pay those back. So there's been a change in sentiment here. No wonder people are really angry, and rightly so, that in that crisis, the government bailed out these huge banks, which consist of all these multimillionaires, but didn't bail out Main Street. And Main Street really suffered as a result.
When we look at kind of the current situation, as we can kind of close out here a little bit. Well, first of all, one of the things I mentioned in that last slide is you just don't see many community banks being formed since this Great Recession. And so that makes you pause a little bit about the types of regulations that were put in that seem to favor the big banks, or at least made it difficult for the smaller banks to compete. We talked a little bit earlier about our current situation, and there's a number of different things that are going on in terms of different types of aid. Obviously the stimulus checks for those making less than $100,000 as a single, $150,000 as a married couple. Unemployment benefits have increased, and some other things. I guess we were talking a little bit earlier about some of the concerns down the road about these things, about the potential for inflation, maybe not so much the next year, but maybe in the next 3 to 5 years. I don't know if you wanted to address that, or just anything about, again, it's a great unknown. It made me feel better. I'm trying to present to my principal's class tomorrow about what's going on right now. And to some degree, you have to say, I don't know, because there's so many independent or exogenous effects that are going to have to take place before we know where we're going. But I don't know if you wanted to talk at all about current policy and just kind of things we have to be concerned about in the future.
I am worried about inflation, not this year, probably not next year, but for a couple of reasons. One reason inflation has been amazingly low was this tremendous volume of imports from China. And if we're going to move more toward closed economy instead of open economy, vis-a-vis China, but hopefully we'll import more, deal more with other countries, Vietnam and so on. You wonder if some of these supply chains have been cut off that were actually helping hold down inflation. All these cheap products you can get at Walmart coming in from China has helped hold down inflation. So I think the upsetting of these supply chains, possibly in the short run, could cause a little bit of inflation. But I'm more worried about in the long run, countries that have had really high debts, high budget deficits, end up saying, hey, we got to reduce the burden of this debt. And the way you do that is deliberately cause some inflation. I think the Fed would love to see 4% of inflation a year for the next decade. That would put us on the path where the burden of all that debt we've been accumulating. I mean, the national debt was not too long ago was 18 trillion, 15 trillion, maybe back when these slides occurred. Then it was up to 22 trillion, but in this 1 year, we're going to add at least 3 trillion, maybe 4 trillion to it. So it'll be up to 26 trillion. And if we get a recurrence of this thing, it's going to go higher. Countries in the past that have had really rapid increases in debt tend to kind of semi-deliberately reduce the burden of that debt with inflation.
Right.
And, if you could get 5% inflation a year, rule of 70 or 72, what would it be, 14 years, you would cut the real debt in half if you could engineer 5% inflation a year. Well, that would cause a lot of problems. Right. That would cause all kinds of distribution of income problems and so on. And with high inflation, the businesses don't invest as much, then you get slower economic growth. But many countries, when they get that far indebted, take a position and let's just engineer some inflation here. Let's reduce the burden of this debt. And not only government debt, but even business debt. A little inflation would help businesses that have got themselves very heavily indebted. So I'm worried about inflation, going up to 4 or 5% a year for a decade or so.
Right.
Which I think would slow economic growth.
Well, and with our aging population, we already face, more spending on entitlements, Social Security, et cetera. And it seems like basically the primary politicians that are addressing these subjects are addressing it more in a competition to say who can, give the most benefits, as opposed to being concerned about what that does to the long-term obligations of the country. I heard President Trump was on town hall the other night, and he was talking about the stimulus and talking about how it started at 2 trillion and it may be getting to 3 trillion. And he said, it may even get to 6 trillion. And he says it like that's a good thing. Look at this. We're going to spend all this money. Hooray for us. And it's,
he's the king of debt. He's the king.
Yeah. It's like, I understand the rationale behind it, but don't be bragging up the idea that we're going to take on more of this debt like it's costless. And it actually came from a question from a young man, I believe it was, his college student, that was saying, look, what are you doing about the debt? And somehow either that question or the next one, he turned it around to saying, we may spend $6 trillion. And I was just like,
well, Mr. Trump was able to default on his debt, but I don't think the U.S. government is going to default on his debt.
We decided not to repudiate the debt a long time ago. So yeah, hopefully we'll stick with that. But
although I do remember when Trump was running for office, he said, why don't we just tell the creditors we'll pay half? Well, that would be essentially defaulting on the debt.
Yeah.
But that's the way he comes up with these statements, and then his advisors say, "Wait, you want to walk that one back?"
Yes. So we're getting uncensored here at the end. But Tom, I really appreciate your time here. I'm going to definitely use this in place of a lecture I was going to give tomorrow, because I think we went almost an hour and a half. But that's great. I mean, I think the students will appreciate it. I may even make this publicly available, if you're okay with it, to our interested alumni or anyone that might want to.
Send me a copy of it, and I'd like
absolutely.
to. Really...
I'll probably just put it up on YouTube, and then that way it's publicly accessible. I think if I'm able to, I'll just put it up on this YouTube, which is a way you can just click on it and see it without filter. So I'll see what I can do on that. Some of these Zoom recordings work differently, but again, great to see you again. And yeah, this is going to end up our semester real nicely.